Can I move maybe an inch or two with that or something? No, yeah, it's going to happen. I mean, this is what it is. What it is. So somebody, would you be able to do the get people with their lapel mic sitting on the podium? Sorry, we've got it running in there. It's on the podium right now. The battery's fully charged, so the only concern that should be close enough. Well, you'll hear if there's any choppiness. I mean, one option can be look just to pop this up on a box and it connected to the box. I think we'll be fine though. I think it should be okay, but it's surprising. I think any obstacles, or if the person has the receiver in their back pocket, that kind of. We'll see how it goes. Yeah. You're not recording this? You're not. Record the concert. Yeah. It'd be kind of awesome to record. I don't know if we have a player, but just to record the lapel mic feed tomorrow. because yeah, but maybe it's beyond what we can easily do. I don't know. So what the way we actually got it. What we did last year? We're not doing what we did last year. Last year, what we did was we just had. It's this pair that's going through. I think last year I had the lapel mic going directly into the camera, which was quite nice because it meant it was very, very good video to watch. But right now we're just doing lapel into the room, I think, which is what we did the year before last. But it's okay. But Owen set up the EQ so that it doesn't create any. Gosh, this guy's got. He's one of the presenters, isn't he? So, not today. Okay. Do you think it'd be asked? I can get it. No, I can do it. It's a good time for me to stand now so that people know I'm here at certain times, like yeah, it's not bad because the last couple of years we've only done it on Saturday, and then that gets really, really packed and it's overflow when we have next year does it. I know some people just end up watching it and CEO of the camera Shazam, he just sat and we had couches in there. You get to see whatever the camera is in. I think we were giving the lapel mic feed was going into the camera. Anyway, but it was very, very clear. I think we did test the Vargas.
All right. I teach a class in this room. This is so wonderful because no one has their laptops open and no one's reading. This is great. So, welcome everybody. This is the 12th iteration of the Music and Brain Symposium. We've been doing this every year for 12 years. And I always start off with a little story about why and how we started. And so just indulge me for a moment. The Music and Brain Symposium started because I was teaching a class like the one I'm teaching in this big class on music and music perception and cognition and music behavior. And all the students have to do projects. And one of the projects was a young, he was a religious studies major. He was a drummer, not formally musically trained, but a drummer. And his question was, why do all ritual drumming sounds, why are they always in the same tempo? And I stopped and I said, prove it. And so he bought a bunch of pieces and we looked at it, and in fact they were pretty close. And so I said, okay, this is interesting, go do this as a project. And he came back with what for me was my introduction to rhythmic entrainment. And from there it was, okay, I have a lot to learn here. And he wanted to go on with it. He had graduated, and he then spent the next year in the sleep lab stealing EEG time, doing experiments on rhythmic entrainment. And the two of us sort of continued to work, and at one point I said, you know, I don't know what I'm talking about. We need to get people here who do. And I said, let's put together a list of the best people who are working on this, and that was the birth of the Music and Brain Symposium. I just invited them, and to my wonderment, everyone said yes. And from that time, every year, I get a huge amount of flack because this is not, you know, there are always people who hear about it and say, why wasn't there a call for a request for papers? Why wasn't there a jury? Who makes the decisions? And I'm embarrassed but very pleased to say that my students and I make these decisions. And every year it's sort of thematically based on, my students are here. So we choose themes and topics and sort of loosely sort of build stories around them. so this year's topic is very broadly about performance. Some of our guests are more closely aligned directly to performance. Some take a larger view of it, but everyone is here because there's at least one of my colleagues and one of my students who have a deep desire to corner, I'm looking at the speakers, to corner you and find out more. And so, so you're all guests here, but the speakers are really here to be used and manipulated and so 12 years. So let me just say a few things about what happened in those 12 years. A lot of my work has I still divide my life between composing and research. And a lot of my research is sort of inspired and threaded through what happens in these symposiums. But the program here has changed dramatically since then. In the 12 years that we've been doing this, we now have a real scientist on our faculty, Takako Fujioka, who is our in-house neuroscientist and one of the only hardcore bona fide scientists who are in a music department. So that's a huge win for Stanford. It's a huge win for us. And God bless Takako and having called our first PhDs this year, Emily Graber, who has a poster downstairs, and Madeline Hubert, who also has a poster downstairs. So our program has changed, our world has changed, and it's been really amazing. So I don't want to take much time here. I just want to do the requisite thank yous, but these are really serious thank yous because I sit in my office and think what needs to get done, and before I make a list of what needs to get done, it's done. So there are some people here who really deserve amazing thanks. Nettie Worthy, our administrator, who has been absolutely stunning. Blair Kaneshiro, who was my undergraduate and my master's student and my PhD, then a postdoc, and now off on her own, but still fundamentally important, and the leader and shaker of the research group that's grown out of this, the Music Engagement Research Group, which you'll see more about. Our current graduate students, Tyson and Madeline and Emily and all of these guys, everyone's pitched in and helped. Particular thank you to Noah Fromm, who one-handedly did amazing things and put this stuff together. Dave Kerr, who does video. Owen Callery, who does audio. The list can just go on and on, but these are, I just can't survive without, and Kitty back there. So you will meet these people, and hopefully they will meet you, and we're in for 2 days of remarkable events with some of truly the most wonderful, insightful people in the field, people who I'm always dying to come. Some are repeat offenders here, one of which is our first speaker here. So let me introduce our first co-speakers. David Eagleman, whose work on synesthesia and whose work on time perception, his paper on time perception, I'm looking at my students in the seminar, required reading, you've done it already. We've talked about his work. We've looked at some of his experiments, and he's now sort of morphed into a sort of a different being, but he's also left Texas and joined us on faculty here. And Anthony Brandt, composer from Rice University, who shares my passion for dividing worlds between research and composing. It gives me enormous pleasure to have you both here. They're going to talk about the work that they've done together, but I think they're also going to branch out and talk a bit separately. So without further ado, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, thank you. And in this symposium about performance, we want to start with talking about creativity and what it is about our species that's so different than others. So here we go.
Honored to be here. Thank you, Jonathan. So for countless generations, beavers have built their dams the same way, and birds their nests, and spiders their webs.
But humans aren't like that for some reason. Here's the way we built shelters for ourselves 10,000 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and 100 years ago, and now. And the skyscrapers are different, not only from the earlier dwellings, but they don't even look like each other.
So what makes human brains so special?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because this is what we want to talk talk about. So the answer has a little bit to do with the opposable thumb and the larynx, but it also has a lot to do with the structure of the human brain. So as the cortex expanded massively in our species, what we got, first of all, was a lot more territory in between input and output. So when sensory data comes in, if you look at other animals' brains, these are close together and they have some sort of reflexive output to that. But with humans, there's a lot more territory there. So stuff comes in and we chew on it and we dwell on it and we think about it, we act, and maybe we don't act. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, in the expansion of the cortex, we got a much larger prefrontal cortex. So that's the part behind the forehead here. And this is the thing that allows us to simulate possible futures, to think about what might be. And so putting those things together, what this allowed us to do is always lean into the future. In other words, we are not bound at our moment in time and space, but we spend most of our time actually thinking about possible future trajectory and generating hypotheses and evaluating them.
So one of the consequences of this is we don't tolerate too much repetition. So maybe you've seen the movie Groundhog Day, in which a weatherman played by Bill Murray is forced to relive Groundhog Day over and over again. But he continually rebels against the monotony. He refuses to live the same day the same way twice. He learns French, becomes a piano virtuoso, plays matchmaker. Why isn't Bill just satisfied to be a creature of habit?
Well, here's why. It's because the brain is constantly seeking novelty, and if you do the same thing over and over, that's uninteresting to it. So when we look at brain activity, we see, for example, a lot of activity the first time that a stimulus is presented, and then as you present the stimulus over and over again, the brain shows less activity. This is what's known as repetition suppression. The brain simply doesn't tolerate things that are repeated, and as a result of that, we have this thirst for novelty, and this is actually the fountainhead of our creativity. But
we don't want things that are too novel. We're happy to spend a few days at Burning Man, but we don't want to be there the whole year. So there's a trade-off between exploring the unknown and exploiting what we already know. There's a constant tug-of-war in the brain between novelty and familiarity. Too much predictability, and we tune out. Too much surprise, and we become disoriented. Creativity lives in that tension. And that's why our world is so densely populated with skeuomorphs, the digital icons of objects in the real world. So the save button is a floppy disk. The phone icon is an old handset. Many of our kids have never seen one of those. Email is an envelope letter. We drag files, which are just zeros and ones, into a trash can. And we buy online in a shopping cart. All of this is a way of keeping an umbilical cord to the past.
so as a result of these two opposing drives between novelty and familiarity, we constantly surround ourselves with things that have never existed before, but they're practical next steps for us. And what this means is that all new ideas evolve from the old.
So innovations that define this generation, like the iPhone, seem to be bolts out of the blue, but they're not. Here's the IBM Simon from 1993. It was a touchscreen cell phone introduced 2 decades before. It's not always obvious or visible, but there was a smooth progression of innovation that got us from here to there. All creativity is based on prior experience. All new ideas have a history.
And Tony and I have written a book on this, by the way, called The Runaway Species, but we also just made a documentary, and here we're interviewing Robert Glasper talking about this point.
Jazz is a blend. It's a music made of a bunch of other music. A lot of people say, well, we can't add hip-hop to jazz. That's not the tradition. Hip-hop wasn't around when jazz was born. But you know what was around? Boogie Woogie was around. Classical music was around. The blues was around. Gospel music was around. All those things that were around were infiltrated into jazz. That jazz wasn't made by spontaneous combustion. Jazz is a reflection of the times. The tradition of jazz is actually that it always changes.
So human innovation comes from this continual process of branching and selection. We tried a lot of ideas, and some of them survive, and those that live become the basis for the next generation of experimentation. So, if all ideas have a history, the question we wanted to know is it possible to understand how ideas evolve? Can we understand how ideas interact to lead to the next generation of ideas?
So we propose a framework that divides the landscape of cognitive operations into 3 basic strategies: bending, breaking, and blending. These are the primary means by which all new ideas evolve. So in bending, you take a source and you transform it or you twist it out of shape.
In breaking, you take something whole and you break it up into pieces.
And in blending, you merge two or more sources. So if you take a man and blend it with a bull, in ancient Greece, you get a minotaur.
And bending, breaking, and blending are the main cognitive operations that we suggest underlie innovative thinking. So what we do as humans is we run around and we apply this kind of thinking to everything around us, and this is how we generate this ongoing tidal wave of novel worlds.
Now, creativity can be difficult to see. A lot of the time, it's hidden under the hood and inaccessible. For instance, we typically don't know what's behind the facade of a building, but there's an ingenious network of pipes, wires, ducts, and everything that keeps the whole system running. And it's invisible to us.
But when you look at something like the Pompidou Center in Paris, the aqueducts and the pipes and the wiring, they're all on the outside of the building. And that's what the arts give us, is overt creativity. The arts showcase the creativity that otherwise lies hidden in our everyday lives. It exposes the innards of the creative process.
So whether creativity is overt or covert, the cognitive tools are the same. So let's take a closer look at how bending, breaking, and blending give birth to new ideas. We'll start with bending. Every time a jazz artist improvises on a standard, they're bending an existing melody.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, and the dream that you dreamed of once in a lullaby.
And similarly, here's an ancient inscription using the Latin alphabet. And this is just a few of the millions of ways that alphabets have been remade. And the question is, why do we need thousands of ways to read the alphabet? It's because humans have this compulsion to bend. So what we value about our computers is that we put in zeros and ones and we get exactly the same thing out years later. But what humans do is whenever we take stuff in, we mash it up and spit out new versions of it.
So sources can be bent in many ways. For instance, you can bend an object's size. For the Rio Olympics, the artist J.R. built an image of the high jumper Muhammad Idris several stories high. And just as bending can enlarge, it can also shrink. These are miniature figurines by the sculptor Alberto Giacometti.
And these examples of overt creativity expose the same creative approach that people use in all fields. So Edwin Land had to solve a big problem with automobiles in the 1920s, which is that there was a lot of glare from oncoming headlights. And so he knew that he could reduce glare by using these polarizing crystals, but they were too big to use for a windshield. And so his aha moment was the same kind of thinking behind Giacometti's figurines, which he realized that the solution was to get the size down to a very tiny size, so you could make these glass sheets with thousands of these tiny crystals embedded inside them. So the driver got a better view of the road that way, but the creativity that produced it, that remained invisible.
Size is just one of the features that can be bent. Architect Frank Gehry looked at the typically flat facades of buildings and wondered, could he bend the shape? And the result is this Gehry building in Lower Manhattan.
And a similar bend is refashioning the future of cars. So one of the impediments to converting engines from gasoline to hydrogen is the bulkiness of the tank. The hydrogen tanks tend to be really big. So there's a company up in the city here that's developing a tank that folds on itself in layers, and it snakes through the unused volume of the car body and finds ways to make the volume work by twisting it around. And you can also bend something like the iPhone, as Ji Wang did here, to make a flute that you blow into. This is the Ocarina app.
The human brain will even bend time. This clip from the movie 300 bends the speed. And time can even run backwards. So we sometimes might fall prey to the end of time illusion, in which we feel that everything that can be done has already been done. But the history of bending tells a different story. There's always more to squeeze out. For instance, take knives. They're practical, well-established tools. This collection of knives is all from 19th century Polynesia. Cultures around the world have never stopped bending the knife.
And look at umbrellas. So these have existed since ancient times, But with the modern folding umbrella, it seems like we've finally reached the end of the line. But it turns out, some of you may know, the United States Patent Office has 4 full-time people just examining umbrella patents. Here's the asymmetrical shape, which has better wind resistance. There's a hands-free umbrella. There you have the ribs on the outside and so on. Because of our perpetual manipulations, human culture never stops exploring variations on themes. And that's why we'll never hear the last version of Over the Rainbow.
So now let's turn to this second tool of innovation. New things are often built by taking something that already exists and taking it apart, and you're going to find examples of breaking all throughout the arts. So for instance, Cubism shattered the visual plane into a mosaic of multiple perspectives. This is Barnett Newman's broken obelisk, in which he snaps an obelisk in half. And in music, fragmentation of a theme is a form of breaking. So here's the opening of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. And here's the development section, made up only of a fragment of the theme.
So there are a lot of ways to break something. David Hockney created this photo collage using relatively big pieces. Meanwhile, in pointillism, you use pieces that are much smaller and there are a lot more of them. And in digital pixelation, the dots are so small that you're not even supposed to see them. And this kind of covert pixelation is what underlies our whole digital universe.
Breaking also gives you the opportunity to leave pieces out. Bruno Catalano leaves out whole chunks of the human body in his sculpture, The Travelers. And the artist Cory Archangel created a video installation by hacking into the computer game Super Mario Brothers and removing everything but the clouds. He then projected the clouds onto large screens for his installation, Super Mario Clouds.
And beyond leaving pieces out, you can also unglue the pieces, allowing a structure to change shape.
David Fisher's dynamic architecture breaks apart the solid frame of a building and allows the floors to move independently.
And engineers designing a prosthetic hand realized they didn't have to be limited by our biology, because our wrists are constrained by our tendons, but the engineers could break that constraint, so why not design a wrist that just keeps on turning? So new technologies are always giving us new ways to take things apart, and this is true not only in the sciences, but in the arts as well.
Now we'll move on to the last of the creative tools, blending, which merges sources. So, for instance, all across the world, cultures have blended humans and animals to create mythological creatures. In ancient Egypt, if you blend a man with a lion, you get a sphinx. In Nigeria, if you blend a woman with a fish, you get a mamiwata. And in Italy, if you blend a lion and a goat, you get this chimera.
And what happens in myth also happens in science. So spider silk is much stronger than steel for its size, but it's very difficult to harvest it, because if you get a bunch of spiders together, they'll fight and eat each other. So a geneticist came up with an idea that's akin to the mythological chimera, and he took the little strand of DNA that makes spider silk and he put that into a goat, and the result was Freckles the spider goat, who secretes spider silk in her milk. So she's a real-life chimera.
Blending, of course, is pervasive in the arts. For instance, in hip-hop music, fragments from previous music are repurposed or blended together to create a new song. Here's a drum solo called the Amen Break from a 1969 song by the band The Winstons. And that solo has been blended into a track by Mentronics. And Salt and Pepper. songs, all of which have blended the DNA of the old into the new.
And human imagination places no limits on what can be blended with what. So, for instance, you can blend the past and the present.
Must go faster.
And you can blend the present and the future.
Does it mean exact change?
Sometimes the elements of a blend touch but don't merge. For instance, IMK blended an Egyptian pyramid into the courtyard of the Louvre Palace, and Frida Kahlo painted her head on the body of the deer. Other times sources are more merged. In the Blur building, the walls are made of water. And in this art installation, human portraits are projected onto trees. And here sources are even more thoroughly mixed. It's not easy to tell that Jasper John's painting consists of the numbers 0 through 9 superimposed on each other.
So to summarize what we're saying so far, when you do something like import an image into a graphics program and tell it that you want to rotate the image, the software doesn't actually care if it's rotating an image of nests or kangaroos or zebras or anything. It's just running an algorithm that operates on the zeros and ones. And in the same way, our neural networks process mental input using very standard subroutines, whether we're thinking about a patent or a new recipe or what to say next. We transform the raw materials of our experience by bending, breaking, and blending them.
So the human mind is like a kitchen. Our storehouse of experiences provides the ingredients, which we then bend, break, and blend to create new mental recipes.
Such as these edible balloons made with green apple puree and helium, the world's first floating food.
So we're all running this software in our brains, and creativity doesn't emerge out of the thin air. We depend on culture to provide us with that storehouse of raw materials, which we then transform.
And we don't just replace the things that don't work, we actually update the things that we love. And that's why fashions constantly change and haircuts evolve through the decades and car makers come out with new models every year. It's not that what's out now isn't good, it's that next year we want something that's even better.
So Edouard Manet broke good to create his 1863 painting Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe. Using this 15th century engraving as a starting point, Manet transformed the three mythological figures in the lower right-hand corner into two bourgeois gentlemen and a prostitute lounging in a Parisian park. The resulting painting helped to launch modern art.
And later, Picasso innovated on what Manet had done. He showed his love for the Manet by remodeling it.
And several generations after that, Robert Colescott remodeled Picasso's iconic Les Demoiselles d'Avignon into his Les Demoiselles d'Alabama. Similarly, Luciano Berio broke good when he blended Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and text of Samuel Beckett into a Mahler scherzo. So creativity is propelled when we treat the past as treasured, but not untouchable.
So when you think about how concepts are related in the brain, every concept is connected in a rich network of associations. But our brains have evolved to be ruthlessly efficient. So when you're hungry, you go out and you find something to eat. You don't dance or paint or something like that. So brains tend to follow the path of least resistance. Certain neural pathways become reinforced over time, and they become the ready answer, the first thought that jumps to mind. And creativity requires finding ways to push the brain off of that path of least resistance. And the way to do that is to proliferate options, to force yourself to go back and not accept the first answer, but try the next thing and the next thing, trying as many different paths as possible.
And that's what you're seeing here. Velasquez is painting Las Meninas, along with 4 of 57 variations that Picasso painted of Las Meninas.
And it's just what happened in the post-Reconstruction South, when George Washington Carver realized that an ideal rotation crop was peanuts, but he knew that Southern farmers wouldn't grow peanuts unless there was a way to sell them, so he invented over 100 uses for the peanut, including peanut oil and milk and face cream and ice cream and punch and glue. And he was given 10 minutes to testify before the House Ways and Means Committee, but they were so impressed by him that they allowed him to testify for a full hour. So this bespeaks the importance of generating options, and this is what industrious minds are constantly doing to generate an ongoing stream of alternatives. So as we land on creative solutions, the important thing for all creators is to ask, what else?
And there's another twist to proliferation. As we've seen, all creativity is tethered to its history. The question is how far to move away from it. On the one hand, if you stay too close to the familiar, you may be left behind. Take the BlackBerry smartphone, the first mobile phone to incorporate a QWERTY keyboard. Here's the BlackBerry market share. What happened? Well, the BlackBerry started off as a winning idea, but the company didn't anticipate how fast touchscreen technology would catch on. The company held on to the right answer for too long.
So sometimes holding on to earlier successes isn't enough. A big leap is what seizes the public imagination. But there's also a risk of going too far, which is that no one may follow. So as an example, between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War II, there were several hundred attempts to create a universal language. And dignitaries like Eleanor Roosevelt really supported this idea because she knew that having a universal language would really help with world peace. And the one you've probably heard of is Esperanto. And nothing came closer to achieving this vision than Esperanto. Just after the Second World War, over 500,000 people petitioned the United Nations to adopt it as the official world language. Here's a clip from a William Shatner movie filmed entirely in Esperanto. But despite the great acting, Esperanto never caught on. And although our world would be enriched by a universal language, asking populations to learn an entirely new language was just too big a move.
It can be challenging to find this sweet spot between familiarity and novelty. Sticking closely to what works can quickly wear out its welcome, but leaving the comfortable too far behind can fail to find followers. So the solution is to go different distances from the familiar. So for instance, designer Sarah Burton created the royal wedding dress worn by Kate Middleton. And she's also created other wedding dresses less likely to be worn.
And the same person who patented this blouse in this refrigerator also came up with the theory of relativity.
In the early 1930s, American industrial designer Norman Bell Geddes devised a host of practical commercial products, including furniture, kitchen appliances, cocktail shakers, and radios. But Bill Geddes didn't stop there. He also imagined futuristic-looking buses, a flying car, an aerial restaurant in which diners would be perched on a rotating mechanism 20 stories tall, and a house with movable walls that could rise up into the ceiling like garage doors.
And innovative companies are always doing this sort of thing. So, for example, Mercedes is constantly upgrading its sedans, but its engineers have also conceived of the Biome concept car, which is a biodegradable car that would be grown entirely from seeds. So the zero emissions fuel wouldn't be stored in a tank, but it would flow through the frame, and the electronics would be powered by the solar sunroof, and so on. But for now, the Biome car doesn't actually exist. It only exists on the computer, and Mercedes has no immediate plans to develop this. But the goal of a concept car isn't to actually be the next car. Instead, it's to focus on a far-reaching possibility on the horizon so that whether or not society ever goes in that direction, it navigates where you can move.
So whether you're an artist or scientist, an optimal strategy is to generate a range of ideas, some of which stay closer to home while others fly farther.
And as part of this, there's no such thing as a can't-miss creative idea. One can never create anything and rest assured of the results. For every good idea that makes it, a lot of others don't survive. It takes a very high risk tolerance to be creative. And many of you probably saw SpaceX's successful launch and landing of the Falcon Heavy a few months ago. But what you may or may not know is that SpaceX released this blooper reel of all the failed attempts that preceded this. So,
across human history, new ideas take root in environments where failure is tolerated. it's important to be fearless in the face of error.
So let's recap.
Creativity is part of the software of every human brain.
Innovation doesn't come out of thin air. Ideas evolve. All new ideas have a history.
The creative process transcends disciplines. We bend, break, and blend our storehouse of experiences, remodeling what we know.
Creativity is overt in the arts. They're the open source software of creativity.
We propel our creativity when we break good, go different distances from the familiar, proliferate options, and tolerate risk.
We are a species with a runaway imagination. As far as we can tell, no other species puts as much effort into exploring imaginary territories. And as a result of this, our innate cognitive software has produced a society with increasingly faster innovation, one that feeds on its latest ideas. So we now have 8 billion brains running around the planet, and they're all running this cognitive software of creativity. And that means there are more raw materials than ever to bend, break, and blend.
Creativity isn't a luxury, and it's not a gift given to the few. It belongs to all of us.
Okay, so now Tony's going to take the next part by himself, and then I'll come back up and take the next part after that. Do you want this time?
I got it.
Okay.
So one of the questions that David and I have investigated is the degree to which human cultures overlap. Does creativity follow relatively similar tracks in different cultures, or does human inventiveness differ significantly, and if so, how much? Many scientists and musicians describe it as a universal language. That is, unlike spoken languages, it doesn't need to be translated. Thanks to our shared humanity, it can transcend human divisions and act as a bridge between cultures.
What's the theory behind this device? Certain universal ideas and concepts common to all intelligent life. This device instantaneously compares the frequency of brainwave patterns, selects those ideas and concepts it recognizes, and then provides the necessary grammar.
So does music function like Star Trek's universal translator? Is it a way we can communicate effectively to anyone on the planet without prior exposure? Is there a world common practice? This raises important questions about music. Do we have an innate preference for certain types of sound? Do scientific hypotheses and discoveries about one type of music necessarily apply to others? And how much is musical performance and expressivity dependent on its cultural milieu? So neuroscientist Isabel Peretz has written that there are two principal anchorage points for the brain specialization for music: the encoding of pitch along musical scales and the ascribing of a regular beat to incoming events. So first of all, it's worth noting that scales and tunes come in a great variety. For instance, the ancient Greeks were constantly experimenting, and legend has it that Timotheus of Miletus was going to be executed by the Spartans for dividing the octave into 11 steps. Composers were treated pretty much the same back then as they are now. When at his trial, he fortuitously pointed to a statue of Apollo holding an 11-string lyre and was pardoned. Indian music, of course, divides the octave into 22 unequal parts, and every gamelan ensemble has a unique tuning. So furthermore, music doesn't have to involve scales. For instance, Mongolian throat singing can be performed on a drone. As can Aboriginal didgeridoo music. And it doesn't have to involve a steady beat, even when there are multiple performers. So for instance, in Hebride's psalmody, everyone sings the same melody, but at their own pace without a shared pulse. Similarly, in Japanese bukaku, the oldest surviving court dance tradition, the musicians are not coordinated by a steady beat. humans have the ability to hear scales and tap to a steady beat, these still leave open a lot of different ways to make music. How about how sounds are combined? Do we have a biological mandate for what we consider to be harmonies? Scientists have investigated this question using a head-turning experiment with infants. Out of one loudspeaker, they played a Mozart minuet. And out of the other loudspeaker, they played a doctored version of the minuet with dissonances substituted for most of the consonances. They then observed the babies to see which loudspeaker they listened to longer. The researchers found that the babies listened much longer to the actual Mozart rather than the doctored version, and they concluded that babies are born with an innate preference for Western-style consonants. But there's a crucial flaw in this assertion. Other cultures with polyphonic music have very different conceptions of pleasing and striking. So for instance, in Bulgarian women's choir music, they often sing in parallel dissonances, which is a technique called diaphone. And in much non-Western polyphony, the notes of the melody or scale can all occur at the same time. That's true for the Kaluli tribe of New Guinea. And the Banda people of the Congo. Let's compare that with Palestrina. So researchers can't have it both ways. They can't view the Kalali and Banda music as so-called primitive and also say there's an innate preference for consonants. So Sandra Trehub and Judy Plantinga repeated the infant experiment, and they overturned the results. They played consonants and dissonant examples for the Western infants, and they found that the infants paid attention the longest to whatever they heard first. They concluded that an innate preference for consonants is unsupportable. And those conclusions were echoed by Josh McDermott, who was able to test the musical preferences of the Tsimane tribe in the Amazon, a people virtually untouched by Western culture. He found that the Tsimane were indifferent to Western distinctions between consonants and dissonants. So it doesn't appear that we are innately conditioned to prefer certain combinations of sounds over others. Now, to many scientists and musicians, music is among humankind's most direct ways of expressing what we're feeling. Is music a universal language of emotion? So to test this, I'm going to play you an excerpt of Chinese music, and I'd like you to rate its emotion on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 representing the depths of sadness and 10 ecstatic joy. Okay, let me quickly poll the audience. How many people would rate it between a 1 and a 3? Okay, how about a 4 and a 7? Okay, an 8 and a 10. All right, so this song is a type of music that dates from the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 AD. It expresses the misery of the women who were serving at the imperial palace. Once they entered the palace, the women were treated as slaves and lost all of their freedom, and they never saw their families again. So to our ears, this music may sound comforting and even cheerful, but in its native culture, it clearly has a very different meaning. Now, both scientists and musicians have proposed that different musical scales are associated with different emotions, and that's something that's true in Indian music, so let's test this. In Indian classical music, each rag, which is roughly the scale on which a raga is based, is meant to evoke a specific emotion, and here's the complete list from an Indian scientific paper. So if you can jot this down, I want to play you 2 raga excerpts and pick one of the emotions for each one, okay? So here's the first one. All right, so pick one. Now we'll try the next one. Okay, for number 1, how many people picked peaceful? Okay, that was peaceful. For number 2, how many people picked sorrow? Okay, that was sorrow. So musical emotion can be hard to read across cultures. And emotional meaning can even be read within a culture. So a recent paper asserts that modern Indian listeners' interpretations of the Hindustani scales do not align with the medieval treatises. But maybe Western music, cue there. Maybe Western music is clearer. I'm going to play you 2 examples of Western music, and once again, please grade them on a scale, with 1 representing the depths of sadness and 10 ecstatic joy. And please sit this out if you speak Italian, okay? Right, so if you could rate that one. And now the next one. Okay, let me quickly poll the audience. How many people rated the first one somewhere between a 1 and a 3? Okay, 4 and a 7? Okay, 8 to 10? All right, how about the second one? 1 and a 3? Okay, 4 to 7? 8 to 10? Wow. So both of these arias are from the same point in operas about Orpheus and Eurydice. They're the moment just after Orpheus has looked back too soon and will never see his wife again. The tragic climax of the story. So we're conditioned by several hundred years of Western music to hear the major mode is happy and the minor mode is sad. And the second aria by Gluck is written in major, so it sounds happier to most of us, and it's easy to misunderstand what emotion Gluck is trying to convey. So what all of these examples suggest is that the emotional connotations of pitch languages are likely to be largely enculturated. You learn what they express through exposure. What about other behavioral cues? A recent study at Harvard incorporated the music of 86 cultures, including hunter-gatherers, herders, and farmers. And the researchers claim that they've identified 6 universal types of song which naive listeners can distinguish through factors such as the number of singers and instruments that are playing, the melodic and rhythmic complexity, and how active the music is. So I'm going to play for you 2 songs, and I want you to pick from this list. Sorry, I jumped my cue. Listen to the following 2 songs and pick them from this list, which you think they belong to. Okay, here we go, number 1.
Este niño lindo que nació de día quiere que lo lleven a una dulcería.
All right, write down what you think that is. Okay, and the next one. Yeah, what do you think that is? So how many people picked lullaby for the first one? Okay. How many people picked lullaby for the second one? Okay, those were both lullabies. So when the Bobanzelli pygmies are putting their children to sleep, they actually sing louder and pat the children on the stomach. So even behavioral cues are not necessarily universal. So one feature that is generally not mentioned on the list of universals is what I would call unbroken flow. That is, once a musical performance begins, the sounds are rarely interrupted by silence. Unbroken flow can be created by a steady pulse, as in African drumming. Or by sustained sound or continuous activity. For instance, in this excerpt, you'll hear a steady drone underlying the more irregular sitar solo. So unbroken flow is remarkably consistent across world cultures, but once again, it's not a universal requirement for music. More than any other tradition, Western composers often disrupt flow. Nowhere else in the world does anybody write music like that. So music is an open frontier, not a closed system. Music varies significantly between cultures, and it evolves within a culture. Here's an example of early Western polyphony. A few hundred years later, Western music could even sound like this. That's an excerpt from Viper's Battaglia, which depicts soldiers drinking in a tavern. And the musicians are instructed to play at their own speed and in their own key. So music is made, and it's made in different ways. And we have to be careful about ascribing the features of one music to all music and mistaking cultural conditioning for absolutes. When we imagine the music of distant galaxies, this is what we think it sounds like. think their music sounds like ours. But even on our own planet, music differs widely between cultures. And thanks to human creativity, music is a universal feature of human experience, but it is not a universal language. Thank you.
Terrific. You know, what I thought I would mention here, so Jonathan mentioned that so I'm a neuroscientist, I do a lot of things in my lab that have to do with time perception and synesthesia and other parts, but what I want to do is talk just for a moment about the issue of synesthesia, which is to say, you know, neuroscience as a community studies the brain at all these different levels, trying to tie it to perception, how we actually perceive things, and recognize how it ties back. And one of the really cool things that I've found over the years is that there are certain inroads where we can make a lot of progress on those sorts of questions. And you know, just as a big overview, many of you have probably thought when you were a kid or on some drunken Saturday night or something, how do I know that what you see as, you know, green is what I see as green? How do we know that it's actually the same thing on the inside? Because there's no necessity for it to be. And the answer is, we don't know the answer to whether we see it the same way on the inside. And it's even worse than that, which is to say my reality and your reality can be very different from one another. For example, I might see the world upside down from the way you see the world, and it wouldn't matter as long as we can transact and negotiate in the outside world together. So one of the things that I've found most fruitful for studying this area is this area of synesthesia. Many of you have probably heard of, if you haven't, it means joined feeling. It's like anesthesia, which means no feeling. It's a condition that used to be thought to be very rare, like 1 in 10,000 people. We now know it's quite common. It's at least 3% of the population has it. It's something like this.
Oh, Cousteau was right. Oh, yeah. Oh, amazing. Each flavor was totally unique. But combine one flavor with another, and something new was created.
Okay, so that's the only animal research I'll talk about, because synesthesia is a uniquely human phenomenon as far as we know, and the most common forms have to do with things like seeing letters or numbers or weekdays and months in color, meaning you see something written, and a person with synesthesia knows that it's written with, let's say, black letters on white, but internally they're having this other thing that gets triggered, a feeling of color that goes along with whatever's going on here. Now, there are many flavors of synesthesia. Just as one example, seeing sounds. This was a woman who painted what it's like when her furnace kicks on. Whoosh, this is what she sees visually. This is a man who tastes shapes. So when he puts a taste in his mouth, he feels something on his fingertips, something that's pointy or round or smooth or dodecahedral. And this is how he knows, for example, when his when his chicken is ready and is cooked to the right level, is how it feels on his fingers. A very common form is what I've named spatial sequence synesthesia, which is where things like weekdays or months or years they seem to have a spatial sense to them. So February is over here, and March is here, and April's here, and it goes around in a circle, things like that. A lot of people have this with years, for example. So when they think about, okay, 1971, that's maybe behind them. It's interesting, because about half the people see the past in front of them, because of the future, you don't know where you're going, so you're sort of backing into the future. Other people see it the other way, but they have this very clear sense. And by the way, I've seen a few people nodding. I'm curious, just based on what I've said so far, how many people have synesthesia? Should be about 3% of the, yeah, that kid's about 3%. Maybe slightly higher in this crowd. Okay, that's interesting. So one of the forms of synesthesia that I've studied a lot over the years has to do with, for example, musical colors. So notes of the scale triggering a color experience. And to a synesthete, it's just self-evidently true that this is the relationship. Whenever they hear this note, there's that color that gets associated with it. And it's not something they're choosing, or it's not something where they're on drugs or they're lying. We've done lots of studies on this sort of thing. Instead, it's just an internal experience that they have about these. I'll tell you in a minute how we know this, how we actually verify this sort of thing. Another one is different intervals. Some people have a sense of taste with that. This was a Nature paper many years ago about different tone intervals and the taste that gets on his tongue. For some people, music and things about the key that you're in or the chord or things will translate to a feeling of body position. So, one woman, when you switch chords or there's different keys or whatever, she feels like she's jumping or moving, and it's not just a poetic description. This is actually what she's feeling is happening with her body. So the question is, what causes synesthesia? And it has to do with increased crosstalk between brain areas. So normally, the areas of your brain that care about things like, let's say letters and colors, these are neighboring areas, but they're not talking with each other. And what happens in synesthesia is that you get more crosstalk between these areas. And we can look at this with brain imaging by putting people in scanners, and we see that. I'll just mention a few things very quickly about synesthesia. One thing is, we don't call it a disease or a disorder. Why? Because it's actually not disadvantageous. I'll just give you an example. One guy who has synesthesia, different letters have different colors for him, and so he can always remember people's names at a party by the colors that are associated with their name. And so lots of artists have synesthesia. Kandinsky, for example, would stand in front of a blank canvas and turn on his phonograph, and he would paint what he was experiencing. That's what he would paint was the music. And this is true of many artists. David Hockney is a famous music color synesthete. There are many musicians with synesthesia. So Amy Beach, for example, she described it this way. She said, C was white, F sharp, black, E, L. Anyway, she goes through and she, this was the colors that she had associated with those keys. Messiaen composed this way. He said his goal was to paint the visible world in sound. He would describe cascades of chords in color. Now the interesting thing is, for each synesthete, it's idiosyncratic. So what one synesthete experiences is different from another. So it actually doesn't totally make sense to paint the visible world in sound, because someone else will get a different experience out of it. Nonetheless, that's how he would find what seemed appropriate to him in his music. Many musicians have synesthesia. Here are just a few. There's been some amount of writing about Scriabin and the question of whether he had synesthesia. It appears not, or it certainly appears that he was very interested in the, in the relationship between music and color, but he was influenced by certain fashions, and it may be the historical evidence demonstrates that he might not have been synesthetic himself. But I promise to tell you how you actually know if somebody's really synesthetic or if they're simply lying or looking for attention. And so what I did many years ago is I set up the synesthesia battery, which is online, free for the whole world to take, and I'll just give you a very quick sense of how this works. For example, if you say, okay, I have colored letters, the way it works is we give you a letter, and then you have a color palette. You can choose one of 16 million different colors that are displayable on your monitor. And so you say, okay, that's exactly the color for T, and you hit go, and then you get the next letter or number at random, and then you get the next one, and you get each letter or number 3 times each in random order. So in total you have 108 trials. So a synesthete shows up like this after taking the test. These are the letters and numbers displayed in the color that they saw, whereas a control who's asked to fake it and asked, okay, use your short-term memory, use your intuition on this, and remember, it turns out it's really hard to remember exactly which color out of 16 million you did 57 trials ago when you're trying to do it. So we can very sensitively discriminate synesthetes from malingerers this way. And we can test many different forms of synesthesia, which we've done. The things I mentioned before about other sequences, Chinese numerals, notes, instrument timbres, things like that. So I'll just mention a few results from that. But the general story is that when I first started studying synesthesia, all the papers had usually one subject up to, let's say, 4 or 5 subjects. We've now rigorously analyzed about 36,000 synesthetes, as in verified them and studied them in great detail. So, and one of the things we do is we look inside their head for what is the anatomical differences. I'll spare you guys that, except to mention it's this issue about more crosstalk between areas. We've also been looking at the genetics of this, and we found a hotspot on chromosome 16. We haven't found exactly the gene or genes. It's going to be likely different genes across different families. But what I'm excited about with this is it's the first hit in when we find it, it'll be the first hit in what I'm calling perceptual genomics, which is how do differences in the genes between us lead to different ways of experiencing the world around us. Okay, so the way that we test for music synesthesia is, for example, you play a note. So you press the thing, you hear a note, you can hear the note as many times as you want, and if you're a music synesthete, let's say for different notes, then you enter, you choose the color for each one, you get the notes 3 times in random order, and this is how we verify synesthesia, and then we can do all kinds of analysis. I'll skip a lot of this stuff except to say for some synesthetes there's a correlation between lightness of the color and the pitch. So as the pitch goes up, the color gets lighter and lighter. This isn't true for all of them, but it's true for many of them. I'll skip some of the details of that. We do the same thing with chords, where many synesthetes for particular chords have particular colors. So you press the button, boom, you hear a chord, and then you choose the color that goes along with that. And what we find for many people is that let me just come back here, which is that it's actually the root note that matters as opposed to the quality of the chord. It's the root note, but I won't go into all the details of this, but I'll just say for many people it's the root note as above, and at the bottom some people have it based on the quality of the chord. If it's minor, if it's diminished seventh, and so on, that's what determines their color. So what we find is a lot of variation with individual synesthetes, but we're able to map on to how they're experiencing it. With instrument timbre, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Many musicians have this sense of a shape. These are just 2 different subjects here, different instruments, and these are the different shapes of what they experience when the music is playing from these instruments. Some people have much more complicated things, even genders and personalities. So there's a lot of text out here that we won't go through, but you just get a sense that for each instrument, this particular subject has masculine or feminine, and then all sorts of personality attributes associated with it. So one of the things that we studied also is the colors that get associated with different instrument timbres. And one of the things that we find in many of the subjects is that the higher the frequency of the instrument, the lighter the color that gets associated with that. And again, there's some variability. Some people have that correlation, and some people don't. So I'm going over this very fast, but I just wanted to give a sense of all the different kinds of synesthesias that people have when it comes to music. There is a hypothesis that's floated around for a long time that people with synesthesia are more likely to become artists or musicians. It's totally not clear whether that's true or not, because even though in the musical community we can survey people and point to many famous musical synesthetes, we've never tested the community of deep sea divers or accountants or whatever. So we don't actually know if synesthesia is overrepresented. Nonetheless, it's plausible that there may be several in there. I'll just mention a couple other things really quickly. One is there was a tribe found in South America recently that has different shapes that they communicate with, and one of these they call Buba, and one of them they call Kiki. And the question is, which one do you think is which? Who thinks that one's Buba and that one's Kiki? Or who thinks that's Buba and that's Kiki? Okay, great. So this was a study from 1928. This is made up. There was no South American tribe. It turns out that everybody thinks that should be called Kiki and that should be called Buba, which leads to this sort of question about, is it the case that everyone has synesthesia of some form, in the sense that we have cross-modal connections that we all experience? As an example of that, if I play the high note on the piano here, or the low note, and I ask you which one is brighter, what would you say? Okay, if I ask you which one is bigger, what would you say? Okay, well that's ridiculous, because all I'm doing is playing a note, and you're talking about brightness and size and so on, but that's what everybody says. Everyone has the same sort of sense of that, this sort of cross-modal connection that happens. So anyway, I wrote a book on this, and if anyone's interested in, if you have synesthesia, go to synesthete.org. I'm going to mention one other thing really quickly, which is that one of the things I've been doing in my lab is studying with deaf people how we can translate the sonic world to them through patterns of vibration on a vest. So here, for example, she's saying on the right, she's saying the word sound, and if you can see this, she's saying the word sound, and then you're seeing it light up different motors on the vest. Each motor is representing a different frequency. Over there, she's saying the word touch, and it's different. And if you can see her shoulders, it's kind of bright here, but you see her shoulders, that's the high frequency touch. I'm actually wearing the vest right now, so as I'm speaking, I'm feeling the sonic world around me, so I can feel what's going on this way. So we're using this with deaf people, but what's been very interesting to me is that this is sort of really caught on in the musical community. So just as an example, there's a group called MAE, Multisensory Aesthetic Experience, and they're using it in their concerts now, and they have people put on the vest and listen to music that way. And we recently did a project with BuzzFeed where they, here, I'll show you this.
Really good. I can feel a clap right now.
So deaf and hearing people here. This got like 2 million views in the first hour it was out. So it was a cool real stuff. Alright, so you take a photo. So this is a comparison of Kendrick versus Drake.
What are we supposed to do during this? Oh wow. Okay. You're supposed to dance?
Oh my God, it felt exactly what it sounds like.
Okay, well, this goes on and on, but let's wrap it up there. I want to say thank you for me and Tony, and then we'll take any questions on anything. So, thanks very much. Okay, what kind of question do you have on anything at all? Yeah.
Way back at the beginning when you were talking about blending and breaking and
Blending, yeah. Bending, breaking, blending.
yeah. So putting all these pieces together, what in your vision does a peaceful world look like?
A peaceful world, is that what you
So I think you're touching on something that's come up, which is the ethics of creativity. In other words, it's something that humans do naturally. It's something that we're never going to stop. It's probably our brains are doing it 24 hours a day. But we know that not everything that human beings create is necessarily good. And, you know, it's a very complicated question. And in our book, we don't really touch on the morality part of it for a couple of reasons. One is the law of unintended consequences. You know, there's missiles technology that's been turned into a way of diagnosing malaria in the third world. And needless to say, there's been things like Einstein's theory of relativity that led to atom bombs. And so it's not always a straight line. I have a good intent, it's going to be a good result.
It's probably never a straight line.
The other part of it is that, you know, when we look out into our school system right now, creativity by and large is being ripped out of the system. And, you know, Houston right now after our Hurricane Harvey, there were all these schools that were damaged. They were running a huge deficit. And of course, the first people to go are the arts teachers. And, you know, it seems to us that no matter what you think about, you know, creativity, good, bad, or indifferent, no child should be deprived of the opportunity to develop that part of themselves. And so we have a responsibility as parents, as educators, to, you know, to instill the kind of values that lead to the creative results that we can all cherish and we want to pass down to make a better world. But it's impossible to control that. And so that's an issue that's beyond creativity itself in a way, and has to do with human social interactions and our successes and failings as beings. You know. So thank you for that question.
What is the variability, the between subject variability in the report of colors?
In the report of what?
Color.
Of colors in synesthesia? Yeah. Oh, tons of variability. Everyone has a totally unique set of colors that they associate. And my colleagues here at Stanford, I published a paper a few years ago showing that there might be some imprinting that happens with that. So just as an example, if you're a child learning how to use what the alphabet is, you might pull a crayon out of a box and draw the letter A 3 million times, and then you pick the next crayon, you draw the letter B, and so on. And it may be that what you're doing sticks. So just as an example, we looked at over like 6,000 subjects. We showed that everyone had a unique set of patterns for their alphabet, a unique pattern of colors, except starting in, I think it was about 1969, there was a group of people that started having the same pattern, and then that rose to about 15% of people by the mid-70s, and then it went back away. And it turned out that was the Fisher-Price magnet set, and a whole bunch of people imprinted on that. Synesthetes imprinted on that in particular, but otherwise we can't, we don't know what's in your homeroom class or something, what you would imprint on. So everyone else seems to be quite different. Yes, in the back.
So you're breaking and bending stuff. You describe it like a human constant, that creativity works this way. But isn't it just the last 200 years in Western culture that has had so much variation and breaking and bending?
Oh,
there
gosh.
are cultures that are very slow in developing, and maybe not even in the lifetime of a person, nothing much changes, right? And it's been like that hundreds of thousands of years, and now we
So
have
again, that's a great question. And that's again a more political issue than it is an internal one in the brain. I mean, we would say that every child's brain, every human brain is essentially running the same software. We may have differ in our abilities, but that's part of being a human being. But, human social interactions are incredibly complex, and it's possible for powerful authorities to suppress that creativity. You can look at countries like North Korea right now, but we would never imagine that if someone from the former Soviet bloc or North Korea were to come to the United States and all of a sudden have the freedom that they wouldn't be able to create. They would flourish in that environment. So again, we've circumscribed our analysis to a very specific part of the human condition, but of course it interacts in very complicated ways with all sorts of other ones. And it's absolutely true what you're saying, but that's not a difference between human populations or time.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me as very interesting while we were researching the book was if you compare different countries, let's say in the 18th century, compare the music that was coming out of France versus Kenya versus Cambodia, and so, and you look at all these different things, it's extremely different, the kind of music that's coming out, but as Tony alluded to in his talk, there's no reason why anyone couldn't have done the same kind of music or art or landscaping or whatever was going on. It's just that we absorb what is available to us, and so part of the reason that we've had this exponential growth in human population just very recently is because now kids can take in lots of stuff. They can take in the whole world. But you can imagine if you lived in a farming village 1,500 years ago, there just might not be that many things there to take in, to absorb, as far as exemplars for you to bend, break, and blend to do something with. So what's happened now, especially because of the internet and because of the population of Homo sapiens, all of a sudden there's more to absorb than ever. And this is why I think we're both cyber optimists on this, which is to say, it's quite possible that the next generation of kids are going to be a lot smarter than we are because they're growing up in a world where it's flat and they've got instant access to everything, which means their diet is much richer than it was for us. Yes?
If you're focusing almost exclusively on bending versus breaking and blending, is there an inherent diminishing returns? Take the internal combustion engine as an example, which they're continually bending it, but there's been great diminishing returns.
There's probably diminishing returns if you choose any one of the three, but what's cool about human brains is that we're constantly mashing everything up using all three of those, at least those three, and combinations of. So yes, of course, if your only option was just to bend one thing that you have, then you'd eventually run out of steam. But if you can then smush it together with some other idea that you've seen, or break it apart, or do all of those in concert, that's when you really get traction. Yes.
Yeah, so you spoke a little bit at the beginning about crosstalk in the brain itself. And so I'm curious to know if you have more information about the physiological basis for the process, and I'm thinking not only this, but often there's ablations or damage or specific regions, or is it just...
Yeah, good question. This is why we're looking for the genes. In a sentence, it's just that neurons have ways of doing excitation or inhibition with one another in very complicated networks. And so we think that it's probably something like an inhibitory receptor that's just slightly tweaked such that these neighboring populations of neurons are talking to each other slightly more than they should be normally, or they would be in the rest of the 97%. In other words, think of it like two countries with a porous border between them. It's like that. So that's what we're expecting with
That is biochemical and across the whole brain rather than in a particular region.
It's probably actually constrained to a particular region.
For synesthesia.
For synesthesia we're talking about, right? Yeah.
I'm just-
Yeah, so
choose which
essentially
one you
just,
want to go to.
yeah, let's say we're talking about
They're all
synesthesia.
different, I'm sure, but-
Yeah, for synesthesia, as you dial up and down this very delicate thing about how much communication or how much separation do two populations have, that's what you can get. It's just more crosstalk or less crosstalk.
Talking in terms of neurotransmitters?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So just the number of receptors that you're expressing, or the power of that receptor to say, okay, I'm going to inhibit this neuron, or I'm going to not inhibit. Yeah. Al.
So David and Anthony, thanks for very creative, choreographed, and fun presentation.
We're like Run DMC.
Yeah, the blending of the two. What I'm wondering is some of your thoughts on intentionality in creativity. Now, of course, not all creativity is the same, but like synesthesia, sort of an unbidden association plus often. And more specifically, how do you find it useful to think of creativity as an emergent property that comes out of chaos and complexity, and it's has that type of unintentionality?
I don't think we've considered it in that framework. The way we think about it more is, you're eating the whole world and you're sticking all this stuff in, and then what's happening unconsciously is all kinds of mashups, and most of those mashups stink in terms of being a good idea, and of those, some fraction's a good idea, and those leak up to consciousness, and most of those stink too. But occasionally there's one thing that actually works, like, oh, wait, if I put that with that, and I did this thing, oh yeah, that really works. And then of that, there's the how something is received by society. So if you do a piece of art, it might flop, it might not work with your colleagues, but so there's lots of trying that goes on, as opposed to, I mentioned this earlier, but just this notion that because we use the word memory, which we shouldn't, or computer scientists shouldn't, and one of us shouldn't use that term, because it confuses things where we think about, okay, well, memory is, you've seen this thing, it goes in the brain, it gets stored there, but in fact, everything is getting mashed up all the time. So anyway, if I've understood your question correctly, which I may not have, but it's just normal operation in the brain saying, okay, here's something else, okay, great, what if I do this? Does that work? I evaluate the hypothesis, oh, no, that didn't do anything, okay, what about this? Does that work? Oh, no, that didn't do anything, and so on. Doing this unconsciously all the time.
And there has to be some level of intentionality, because after all, Beethoven was never walking in the Vienna woods and came up with like a great design for a new type of carriage. He was always being guided musically, and one of the critiques we have sometimes is that advice that you're more creative, you daydream. But we would say you have to prime yourself with some sort of a creative challenge first. You work on it, maybe even consciously, and then the brain takes over and does the work unconsciously. And so there's this mysterious but wonderful conversation that happens between even a conscious intention and then your brain taking over and doing it on its own. It is mysterious though, but certainly not totally of chaos.
And this is why part of our advice, a big part of it, is just this proliferation of options, because that is the way to to get off the path of least resistance and to make sure, okay, here's this great idea. Oh, I think that's a great way to do that. Oh, you know, but if I come up with 10 other ideas, I might realize that way sort of was the most obvious, and that this other way is pretty clever. But it's the intention of saying, I'm going to be the kind of person who proliferates options every time instead of goes with the first thing. I think there was a question back there, and then you, yeah. Okay. Yes. Yep.
Well, thank you again. These were great talks. I'm trying to get a handle on the synesthesia situation. You described it almost as adaptive. It's not a disease. It looks like associations, brain networks, which you would think would be adaptive, but doesn't seem to be talking long term, right? Like we don't see Ligeti type scores in colors that children learn from, even if only some small percentage.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could generate a Stroop effect that carries across synesthetes, such as a mismatch of color to sound, and whether you think that this is something that benefits the individual, a working memory kind of cue, right, an associationist cue, but has no lasting evolutionary potential.
It's exactly the last thing that he said, which is it benefits the individual provably because, just as an example, you know, if somebody tells me their phone number, I'll forget it. But if I'm a synesthete, I might think, oh yeah, that has a nice autumn pattern to it, and then it helps me remember. So synesthetes are provably better at working memory tasks because of, essentially they're taking this data and they're hooking something else with it. So it helps for the individual, but only for things that are kind of arbitrary, like numbers or weekdays or months or letters, things that have a little bit to do with our survival, but not that much to do with reproduction and so on. And that's why synesthesia, we don't really see it as a disease, but nor do we see it as an adaptive quality. It's just an alternative way of having consciousness. And if it were adaptive, exactly as you intuited, it would have caught on in the population. We'd all be synesthetes. We wouldn't even be talking about it.
Is absolute pitch correlated with synesthesia?
There does appear to be a correlation there. And this is something that needs to be studied more. But many people with absolute pitch have a color that is associated. And in fact, I know a drummer who tunes drums based, he says, oh, it's a little too blue if I do that, it's a little too yellow. Yeah.
So I'm a grapheme color synesthete, and I actually have a Stroop effect for you. I had a really hard time learning music theory because the letter of the key and the number of sharps or flats did not match up. Yeah. And so I was always confused.
And absolute pitch people have the same Stroop effect when theory is taught or ear training through relative terms for the rest of the world.
Exactly, and people have demonstrated in literature Stroop effects with synesthetes, but it's individual for each synesthete is the thing. There's not sort of one generalized test, yeah. Okay, I think there were these two, and then yeah.
Okay, about right brain, left brain. People have, which is this, they say that one side is creative, one isn't. I was, a couple of years ago, I was talking to Robert Ornstein, and he said that that's out the window totally. I wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's out the window because there are more similarities between the two hemispheres than differences. The right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, sorry, is slightly more involved in fine motor movement, and that may be why we have language on that side also. And the right, you've got, for example, these areas involved in speech and language. You have these equivalent mirror image areas that are involved in music on the right side in almost everybody. And so, but it appears the reason it turns out that way is because the left hemisphere is just slightly more involved in fine motor things, and the right is involved in more coarse motor things like motor movements and so on. Otherwise, the two hemispheres are much more similar than different, and that's why that's out the window.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that question.
Yeah, and that connects back to Kay's question because it really is, creativity is a whole brain experience. So it's not localized in any particular area.
Yeah. First you.
Question about your vest.
Yes.
How is the vocabulary? How long does it take to actually, develop the vocabulary that you can understand something?
Yeah. So the vocabulary is each motor is representing a different frequency from low to high, which is exactly what your inner ear does. So what we're doing essentially is taking the inner ear and transferring it to the torso. So there are 212 genetic reasons why somebody can go deaf, and so we're just circumventing the whole thing and saying, all right, here's the way of doing it. So the answer to your question is, when a child is born, they have to learn how to use their ear. And part of that, you know, a child babbles, they do motor output, and then they hear that, and they get better and better through time at doing this sort of thing. And they watch people, and they clap, and they hear. They're learning how to correlate things with what's going on in their inner ear. Same thing here. So we have all these games that we've made to train people up on it, but really the way they learn it is by watching lips and feeling it at the same time, and by vocalizing and feeling it, and just closing the loop that way. So it takes, as an example, I didn't include it in this talk, but we've got this video from our first subject who ever used this. We trained him for 2 hours a day for 4 days, and on his 5th day, he could discriminate words very well. So my graduate student would say a word to him, and he would feel it on the vest. This guy's profoundly deaf. He'd feel it on the vest, and he'd write the word on the board. So it's.
Yeah, I remember that from your brain series. But
yeah. So that so
any further data on that? That's what I was.
We're actually running a long-term study right now on a wristband. So we've made a wristband which is doing the same thing. It's capturing all the sound and converting it to 8 motors in here. So this is sort of, as cool as the vest is with the lights, this is lower friction for users just to stick this on. It's like a Fitbit. And so we're running a long-term study right now. So ask me in 25 more days and I'll tell you how good they were able to get after that period. Yes, all the way in the back. And then.
How is the language kind of connected to this creativity? Like, is it necessary to be able to kind of express in a rich way internally all of these artifacts in order to be creative, or is not need that?
Presume you mean just creativity in general?
In other words, can you be creative by thinking internally in Chinese, like if it's not your native language, for example? Like thinking about what you're going to do, mumbling to yourself.
Yeah. So if I've understood your question correctly, there's a question that's been around about consciousness. Like, in order to have conscious thoughts, do I need to have language? And so a lot of people have intuited the answer to that is yes. But then a group did a study where they put essentially a little pager on people, and several times a day, at a random time, the thing would beep off, and you're supposed to write down what you were thinking right at that moment when it beeped off. So it would just beep off randomly. And what they discovered is that most of thinking doesn't involve language, actually. Most of thinking, I might be thinking, okay, how am I going to move this thing over to here and do that? But I'm doing it without language. It's just a motoric thing or whatever it is. And if you are Beethoven, presumably you're not thinking, okay, if I put a C and a D, instead it's some other thing. And if I'm an artist, if I'm a pointillist painter, I'm probably not thinking about it linguistically, but in this other way of what the medium is.
And there's, I think, a lot of virtuous loops in human culture. I mean, something we didn't touch on in our talk is how much we need each other, and surprising each other, engaging each other, and how that turns into something that essentially motivates us to be even more creative. But even also that, language, you can be creative without language, but language is a wonderful software for being creative in. And in fact, it's designed to bend, break, and blend so we can constantly be updating what we want to say to each other. And all of those things feed on each other. And we've created this wonderful, ecosystem for ourselves, really to propel this part of our nature.
Yes.
Okay, so from the very beginning of your talk, yes, the humans we have our own style of creativity. Nature is audacious in its perpetual creativity over time, and species and plants and everything. But have you at all worked with some of these new things where animals, they're teaching language and the creativity of everything from parrots and crows to octopuses and all of that? Have you explored any of that?
Sure, yeah. There are lots of beautiful examples, the way animals build nests, the way that octopuses figure out what's going on, and they figure out ways of doing things and building shelters out of shells and so on. The reason that we called our book The Runaway Species is because although there definitely is creativity in the animal world, we're doing something really different. I mean, if you look in the ocean at octopus layers, or you look over a forest at how animals are doing things, and then you fly over a city, it's just, it's like this whole thing's risen out of the earth like a motherboard. Humans have just completely gone nuts on this stuff, in a good way, in terms of their creativity. So that's why we're the runaway species. It's not saying no other species is creative, but it's at a much lower level.
I get a lot of pushback from my daughter about this question, because she's always upset with us that, you know, we're like humans, you know, but it's also interesting that there is some creative behavior that's observed in animals, but only in the lab, as if in their natural condition, it's not being called upon or it's not rewarded. And actually, I think that that helps us rather than hurts us, because it shows that it's a biological thing, that it's already evolving, and that it just reaches its fruition in a way, in its peak in human beings, but it's there implicitly and a little bit explicitly in other animals.
Yeah, and actually, let me return to a point that Tony made before, which is one of the things that's very clear with humans is, who knows if it's happening with other animals, is we really want to surprise and impress one another. So if you look around next time you're at a dinner party at what people are doing, so on, everyone's trying to say the zinger that makes them go, oh, that's great. And you never repeat a joke twice or something because everyone's already heard it. So we're constantly trying to do that. So one of the suggestions we make in the book is that if we really want to build a good artificial intelligence system, the way to do it would be to build a whole community of AI agents that are all trying to surprise and impress one another, and that way you bootstrap the whole thing. So, yes, all the way in the back.
So that's so interesting you said that, because that is definitely African American compositional strategies, is to surprise and impress one another. I see you and I raise you. And the other thing that it makes me think of is the internal, external, like framing and paradigms. So you're talking about bending, breaking, and
blending.
Blending. That is like, that's remixing, that's rap, that's, you know, that's slaves in America and Western culture. You know? And the reason I think of this in terms of like, okay, that language, I'm like, yeah, I'm very familiar with that language. That's the language of black people. Like, that's okay, this just is. I'm like, yes. So it's just, to me, the relationship between consciousness and linguistic and calling something and that kind of thing. Also, I went to China a couple of years ago. I'm a choreographer. And there are 2,000 at least different dances there. And they were asking me how to be creative. And then I went to one of their famous schools where they demonstrated just a few of them, and then they had ballet, and then they had contemporary, which looked not creative, but kind of staid, compared to every kind of manifestation of dance and music you could imagine. And they're asking me, and I was thinking that it wasn't that they didn't have all this creativity, it's that unlike what we do here, which is to bend, break, and blend, they don't think of it that way. Not because they don't have it, they have it in spades. I just thought to myself, I would like to get a Fulbright to go to China and learn 2,000 dances and then wow. And then I was thinking that that's something that has made America the place it has been, with everybody coming from everywhere. So I just wanted to say that it, like that, and I won't do it if I do. I'm like, yes, and I'm just wondering if the acknowledgement of that paradigm is what's making more possible, not that people haven't been doing it that way, or don't.
Cool. I mean, I would just say two things really quickly, which is the reason they have 2,000 dances is from a history of bending, breaking, and blending. That's how they got there. Sometimes, I don't know who asked you how to be more creative, but sometimes what happens, and this ties back to the educational system, is that the next generation is taught, okay, here are 2,000 ways of doing it, but they don't get to springboard off of that and make their 2,050 other ways of doing it. So a big part of whether the person feels creative or not, even embedded in a community like that, is whether they're getting the opportunity to do it. This is why at the end of our book we write a whole chapter about education and the importance of not only teaching children what have come before, but making sure there's enough time at the end of the semester where they get to springboard off in their own directions and put everything together in new ways. Yeah, and by the way, what you said about music, that's absolutely right. And you see that everywhere where there's a mixture of cultures, wherever you have people coming to places, you get incredible music coming out of there that is essentially just smashing these different things together. Okay, let's see.
Yeah?
Yep.
Hi. Great. Just fantastic. I'm so glad I could come. I've got so many questions in my mind. David, I'm wondering if your work touches on neurons in the stomach, because I've read some research about that. And then there's a separate question, which is, I'll just throw it all out there. There's a theory in family structures that the firstborn child is raised to be more responsible, whereas secondborn, thirdborn are not as loyal to the family structures. So in terms of immigration to America, the second, thirdborn have been the ones to come over here. And I'm wondering if that type of daring sensibility over the past century and a half might have influenced here our propensity to bend, break, and blend, and then with technology to export those ideas more rapidly than in centuries past.
Good question. We'll answer those in reverse orders, which there are two advantages. It may well be that anywhere where you have lots of immigration to a place, it's more daring people who actually make the journey to get there, so that's exactly right. And the other thing is what we were just talking about, which is then you just get this great mashup of things, and so lots of extra stuff comes out of there because people's diets are bigger than the people who lived in the village 1,500 years ago. As far as neurons in the stomach, probably not involved in creativity. This is essentially the main, what would you call it? Like the central city area, and this is the greater metro area, and so maybe it has some influence, but not in any way that when people get brain damage, you see very particular things that happen, but when people get damage to their torso, you don't see much of a change in creativity, as far as we know.
Except for chefs.
Yes. So we'll take two more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Yes.
You gave, thank you, wonderful lecture. Thank you. So you gave a bunch of examples of different kind of music and showed how a lot of the emotional response was culturally based, right? And we could, hearing a Western piece, we would get everything right, and hearing something else, or many of us would mainly get it wrong, that kind of thing. And that was across a lot of different things, right? About harmony, and dissonance, polyphony, tempos, and modes, and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. Is there anything that's common other than you have an emotional response to music that's not purely cultural based across cultures?
So what Jonathan talked about at the very beginning, entrainment is absolutely true. And in fact, it's the basis of a very powerful therapy by Michael Fout. But the interesting thing about that therapy is it doesn't depend on the kind of music or the quality of the music. It's the nature of the rhythms, and you can train, for instance, people with Parkinson's disease to move much better by training them with certain kinds of rhythms. So that is something that binds humanity together. But what I really try to emphasize is that there are limited creative constraints, and that music is being reimagined and remade all over the place. And we're not even just talking about Western composers, we're talking about indigenous cultures who have followed their own particular track, developing flourishing musical cultures which are often unrecognizable to each other. And in that sense, to be perfectly honest, are there trends? Yes. Are there certain things that tend to be more favored than not? Absolutely. But you have to be really careful when you put the word universal on it, because universal isn't supposed to have exceptions. And it's certainly not supposed to have notable exceptions. And so that's where a lot of that just doesn't meet the standard. And I will often say that everything that I showed you could be totally wrong, except that every claim for universality has to be tested much more diverse populations. And it's one of the limitations of the science right now, a large part because of the funding and where the scientists are located, that often the populations are very narrow. And claims are being made for universality that are really drawing from a very small subset of Western trained listeners. And so everything should be tested in a much broader way whenever the claim of universality is on the table. Thank you.
Somebody asked a question.
Yeah, I guess
I'll give you the comment later.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, let's take someone who hasn't asked. Have you asked a question before? Okay, great. You're up.
So, bending, breaking, blending. There's probably a lot of other words. In fact, we know historically there's a lot of other words to describe the process of creativity. So, why settle on these three, and what else got knocked off the table? Because it seems like it aligns with an agenda. So, yeah.
So, we've talked about this. It would be the same thing if the words all didn't start with a B. That's a nice linguistic thing that makes it more memorable. But what we really tried to do was to show that the same cognitive tools are operating in all sorts of disciplines. And then in fact, the arts have an important cultural value above and beyond what they express, which is already powerful and wonderful, in exposing the innards of the creative process that transcends disciplines. And our claim essentially is that bending, breaking, and blending are flexible enough, and working together, they create such enormous diversity that they are a complete toolkit. And that maybe we would analyze the same thing and say, oh, they bent this first and then they blended it. It's not always possible to say what was the order or exactly what was the creative person motivated to do. But by highlighting the presence of each of these tools in a way that, hopefully is very vivid, you go, oh, of course, how could they have thought of that without thinking about theme and variations? How could they have thought of that without thinking about taking something apart? How could they have thought about it without thinking about smushing something together? And basically, those three cognitive strategies, we feel can result in the whole proliferation of human culture.
Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
So, thank you both. This is a wonderful setup for both this evening and tomorrow. We have speakers who are going to talk about the creative process of music, but also their research and their research methods are among the most creative I've come across. So we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, Elaine Chu, who is closing tomorrow's talk series, will give us a performance that starts with Haydn, the master of surprise and expectation, ends with Chopin, and in the middle has experiments with computational music and biologically created music. And so it was really the sort of perfect paradigm for today. So don't miss it. We'll have a, what's it called? Thing with drinks. Where people drink and stuff. And come out at 8 o'clock. Thank you.
We became good friends. Well, when I I can tell you the name of my
I don't know. No?
No, it's been
That is mine. That's all right with me.
all right, thank you. I didn't want to take you.
Very pleasant.
Oh, thank you. Very.
Oh, okay. That's an actual yeah, I don't think it's going to be used that way, but I believe you can record your playing on the disc. Have you ever seen the old-fashioned
It's actually where
so, you know, you can play things.
Just need to fade.
Oh, yeah, in this case, it's not piano.
Oh, yeah.
So you could play much more elaborate and ornamented because
So he's actually holding in there. On the infinite distance. No, I only made sure I'm understanding my
Thank you.
Yes, it's on
Any licenses.
Welcome back. I am, to quote the great Owen Collery, turn your damn cell phones off, please. That's my job, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Election.
So that was a piece by Cheryl Frances Hode that copied the rhythms from the Haydn piece. So it's called Stolen Rhythm. And the next piece is also based on the same Haydn piece, and it's based on a sight reading I did of the Haydn piece. And it's transcribed note for note, all the mistakes, all the repetitions, and you'll hear all of that in this transcription by Peter Child, and it's a project that's a collaboration between myself, Peter Child, and Lena Vista-Gröning, who's a conceptual artist. And it was written for a Haydn program, which is why it is here. And so you will hear it in the context in which it was created.
This piano control is very good.
laboratory of computer-generated music. And it's similar to Cheryl Francis Hode's technique. We're stealing rhythms from existing music. We're not just stealing rhythms, we're also stealing the repeated patterns and the tension profile, the harmonic tensions. So if in the original piece it was dissonant and harmonically tense, then in the new generated piece it would also be dissonant and harmonically tense. So this is work with Doreen Hermans, who did her postdoctoral work as a Marie Curie Fellow in my lab. And this was generated by her software called Morpheus. pieces. It's the first time I'm performing them in front of an audience. And both of them are based on ventricular tachycardia episodes as recorded in a catheterization lab. So the short name is cath lab. And these are electrophysiology procedures. In the first one, the tachycardia is induced with pacing and stopped with anti-tachycardia pacing. And in the second one, that's the person's own natural, it was spontaneously started and it ended on its own. So it's the person's own natural tachycardia episode. So you will hear a slower bit, a faster bit, and a slower bit in each of those cases. So it's in a nice form. But everything else is, the rhythms are entirely copied from the electrocardiogram. And the notes themselves are stolen from pieces that have similar rhythms to the original electrocardiogram rhythms. this note material was stolen.
Yeah.